Hello. Welcome to the July EMPA webinar. We are very happy to see you all. We've had 200 registrations for this panel session, so we're really excited about that. It's a milestone for EMPA. Before we go further, though, I just want to acknowledge that we're coming to you today from Toowoomba in Queensland. So we're honouring and respecting the Waka Waka, Jaraware and Guyabal peoples, who are the First Nation custodians of the land where we're meeting. We acknowledge and recognise the significance of our shared history, and we support the continued connections of First Nations people to country. So I just, in the vein of that respect, I wonder if you could all introduce yourselves in the chat and also acknowledge the First Nations people where you're coming from. So today we're talking about the EMPA Principle number 3. We have a set of 7 principles that were developed over a long period of consultation across a range of sectors and activities within the emergency management area and also countries. And today it's principle number 3, which is community-focused communication. So our guests today are Julianne Webster-Scott, Angela Van Dyke and Rebecca Riggs. Julianne Webster-Scott comes to us from Rockhampton, where she's Queensland Foreign Emergency Services Rockhampton Region Community Engagement Officer. Rockhampton's had a really tough time lately. It started as the first region in Queensland's history to record a catastrophic fire day in 2018, and then suffered through the massive Gracemere fire, which is still one of the biggest and most effective disaster evacuations in Queensland. Then they were hit by floods, a damaging hailstorm, more bushfires in 2019, and then violent storms. So there'll be plenty I've missed from that list. Julianne's worked in community engagement for QFES in regional Queensland for 16 years. Angela Van Dyke is the Chief Executive Officer of Riverstone Neighbourhood Centre and Community Aid Service, which is in the Hawkesbury Nepean flood basin between Windsor and Blacktown, and was badly affected by floods both earlier this year and also 2 weeks ago. Angela has a long career working for a range of state departments, local government and not-for-profit agencies. She's lived and worked in Western Sydney and southwestern Sydney, and this has fueled her passion for social justice and health equity. So Riverstone Neighbourhood Centre offers a range of services and programs to the rapidly growing community for all ages across the lifespan. It also includes community connection and inclusion, events, health activities, and a few other things, but also responding to the community when disaster strikes, such as pandemic or the recent floods in the Hawkesbury Nepean. And Rebecca Riggs is a director of EMPA and the driver of the development of the EMPA Principles of Communication in Disaster and Emergency Management, which you can see on our website. And also Bianca's put a link up in the chat. So Beck has worked in crisis communication and disaster recovery since 2010. And she's worked in the 2011 Lockyer Valley Floods Recovery Communication and was part of the New South Wales SES 2017 Post-Flood Recovery Debriefs, as well as the New South Wales Office of the Emergency Management 2019 to 20 bushfires recovery teams that supported local governments in their community recovery efforts. She's an advocate for getting recovery right and believes that communication will be the foundation to our success in this. So welcome to the panel. Starting with Angela, can each of you just tell us about the communities you work with and what you're doing with them at the moment?
Yeah, thank you so much and for the opportunity to join you all today. Riverstone Neighbourhood Centre is based in Riverstone. We're in Blacktown Northwest Precinct. And interestingly, we have an older established community here and we are part of Sydney's Northwest Growth Area. So there's a huge population increase in our community. And I guess in that flood catchment part of our precinct, where we once may have had 5,000 people, we now have 50,000 people. So it's a big impact. We were impacted by floods last year, so we've had 4 in 18 months, like many others in community across the state and the country. And I guess for us, it's been an interesting journey, not only supporting community, but also having been impacted by water ourselves and dealing with prepared to evacuate and thinking about service continuity. So it's been an interesting journey.
Julianne, tell us about Rockhampton and where you fit.
Yeah, so I'm the Regional Community Engagement Officer for our Central region. So we run from the Whitsundays down to Agnes Water, right out Longreach to the South Australian border. So it's about double the size of Victoria.
Julianne, can you just give us a bit of a glimpse of what Rockhampton's been through in the past 5 to 6 years?
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem like we get that much of a break. There's we had the first catastrophic fires, I think it was 2018, and that was in the Capricorn in the Central Highlands area. So we were dealing with that. At that point in time, I believe there was about 9 evacuations that were happening within our region. And then the other fires that were happening, we've been hit by cyclones. Flooding in our area comes when the sun is shining because of the Fitzroy catchment, lots of storms and things like that. So basically, I think we're looking at a bit of disaster fatigue.
Thanks, Julianne. Beck.
I work all over the place, as you know, and I work with communication teams and community engagement teams and sometimes community development teams with a whole lot of different communities. I might just add that I'm at the moment living and working on the lands of the Turrbal people. And I guess one of the interesting things for me is that when we talk about the communities we serve, they are so extraordinarily varied. You know, we might say I'm working in the Brisbane area, or, you know, even I'm working in the Organflower area, but that community will always be much more complicated than we can ever fully strategize around. So I guess no matter who I'm working with or where I'm working, I try to keep that in mind, that I need to dig deeper and ever deeper into exactly who is there for me to do the work I do well. Yeah, that's my answer to that.
All right, so we'll press on with the panel discussion then. So I'll just summarise principle number 3. It's people are the primary focus. We need to work with communities and we need to build communication policy plans and practice that really acknowledge a community's capacity and complexity, its perspectives and priorities. So that complexity, starting with you, Angela, in terms of what you've seen and dealt with in the last 12 months, are we doing this communication well?
I'm going, oh dear, someone is doing work outside our building. I do apologise. In terms of the last 18 months, so we've had 4 floods in 18 months. I do want to acknowledge I'm speaking purely from the perspective of the community that I work in. And I also want to acknowledge it, you know, responding to disaster is a very complex beast of an activity, if I can put it that way. What we have seen in our community is a whole raft of very large entities doing very important work. But what we think we're missing continuously, despite the learnings, and despite our organisation and our local chamber, because it's us two that really drive responses in our community, we're often forgotten, unfortunately, is a focus on people, which is what this principle is about. And I think, and I say this with all due respect to all the parties involved, but I think the focus on people seems to be the people in those entities and what they need to do, as opposed to why we all actually exist in a disaster response and what's the end game, which is keeping people safe and getting them out of harm's way and then helping with recovery. So I guess for us that we lose sight of that principle and how community is part of that journey. And I have to say, after 4 occasions now in very close succession, I think the community is not an equal stakeholder in this process, in the communication process. And consequently, what we see repeatedly after every occasion and all the feedback, the system remains the same. The system is focused on the bureaucracy and not so much on how it works for community and the people impacted in a nutshell.
Angela, can you give us an example of how that might look?
I think she's frozen, Barb.
Yeah, she's frozen. We might just move on to you, Julianne. So what if, in terms of what you've seen and dealt with in the past 12 to 18 months, or even like in the case of Rockhampton, the last 6 years, are we doing this well?
I think there's always room for continuous improvement. So we're very much focusing on the people, really having a look of what our communities are made of, up of, who they are. We've got, as I say, every community is different, and we really need to understand, actually talk with the people in the community and to ascertain, do you understand what the risks are when they come, whether you've experienced it before, and if you've got the right tools, what's the gaps that we can provide you with the tools, education or etc., that type of thing. There's been a huge amount of recovery work, as you would understand. After each event that we have, there's you'll normally see a lot of Category C funding projects. So there's been a huge amount of work in the area. But yeah, really taking it back to understanding the community and talking with the community so that we can give them what they need.
So how do you do that, Julianne, in a small team, the way you're set up?
But look, we're trying to build the capacity and capability of our people, because everyone is engaging. It doesn't matter whether you've got an engagement officer title, everyone in our service at some point engages with the community. So building the skills of our people, the confidence of our people to be actually have that conversation and not be scared of it. So that's what we're trying to do. We're also building community engagement networks within the region, where different people from services will get together. We really want to find out what's happening from the ground, and then find out regionally how we can support the people on the ground to do their work. And that's starting to really take off now, and into different little pockets within the area. I hope that answered that question.
So Beck, you have a unique position because you're outside the system and also the locations of these events, and you're sort of you have a perspective of an outsider looking in. So what can you see around whether we do this well and sort of where we're going with it?
So one thing, without a doubt, it has become part of the discourse and part of our good intentions in a growing wave over the last 10 years, led by organisations with a real community focus like the Red Cross and others, who had advocates into the emergency management space that initially were going, no, we are conveyors of information. We are the single point of truth, and all we have to do is convey this single point of truth to the people out there, and we will do our job. And that there has been a real movement of community engagement practitioners, community development practitioners saying that isn't enough. And I absolutely think that has been heard and taken on, and the change, we're on that wave of improvement without a doubt. But I think, as Julianne said, there's always room for improvement. And I would say that some of the glitches that I see are systemic organisational glitches where, for example, the community engagement team and the comms team work to separate systems or separate parts of the org chart, and they don't necessarily channel into each other. And the other one that I think is really important, if an organisation is saying, yep, we are, we care about the community, or we do a lot of work in the community space, or our focus is on community, I'd say, what are your incoming channels? Ask yourselves that. Where is that big resourcing and effort to get information from the community in? Because if we're not doing that, we are still a notice board. We may be getting better at being a notice board, but, you know, and we may be being very sophisticated in the ways we pump out that information. But unless it is a conversation, we're not really working in the community space. And there's one other thing. I did some work recently in the reconciliation space, and I was really challenged by the idea of there are 3 levels of reconciliation or working with community, and in this case with First Peoples community, working on, working with, and working for. I think we're past in most circumstances working on our communities. I think we know we need to work with our communities, but I'm not sure. And I was really challenged with the idea that I actually need day by day, choice by choice, to realize that I'm working for the community. Because if I'm not offering things in the way that they need them, I'm not allowed to get frustrated that they didn't understand. I'm not allowed to get frustrated that they're driving through the floodwater or not evacuating when they should. I'm actually working for them. So I need to refresh the way that I'm working and get better information in so that I can share more, you know, whatever it is that is needed to get the change that I want to get.
I've got a question for Angela based on that, Beck. But before we move on, we've just got a little technical glitch that means we can't read anything coming in the chat. So if you have questions, if you could put them in the Q&A and I'll put them in as they come up. Angela, that concept of having a conduit into the organisation from the community, that seems to be you and the Chamber of Commerce in your community. How difficult is that, and how have you facilitated that?
I think, not surprisingly to many who are with us today, being a community-based org, we know the evidence tells us local, place-based, has a relationship with community, we're trusted by community, and people engage with us. Same with our local Chamber of Commerce. It has been very difficult because we don't have any funded positions to manage disaster recovery. We are today hosting a disaster recovery assistance point for a couple of weeks. So that becomes challenging. Many of us in the sector haven't really done disaster throughout our careers, or it wasn't something that we covered off in our studies. So it's an area, I think, that as climate changes and we see more frequent disasters, maybe something that's our educational sectors might want to look at. And I guess for us, having all of our team and those key people in the Chamber of Commerce that were working with us, having those phones on, it's very frustrating, though, in this system where we are actually in this community. We know exactly what's going on. People are calling us, they're sending us images, they're desperate to get out and be safe. And yet the emergency management organisations in this system don't believe us. They say, no, that's not true. That person in that role over there says there's no problem. And so I take on board the comments everyone's made so far today, but as much as we are that conduit and people are communicating with us and we are local, it's very difficult when you have a system that's so rigid with those public entities. And we are desperately fighting to get into that circle to have a voice for and with our community. And it brings me back to the point I made earlier. What's the point of all this? Is it to tick our boxes as service providers, or is it actually to say what's our intention here? And if we think about a really trauma-informed approach and a client-centred approach, I think there's a huge amount of space for improvement. And again, I speak about our experience here, not everywhere else. But I think local community-based organisations, in our case, we've got the Neighbourhood Centre, but there's communities where you might have migrant resource centres, you could have Indigenous communities, you could have people like your Lions and all sorts of different groups out in the community that have really strong profiles and connection. And we're not tapping into that. And after numerous reviews and inquiries and the same things are brought to the fore, we're not really learning from our learnings. We're not adapting very much.
Are you involved in the debrief process at all, Angela?
No, we actually advocated very strongly that we should have a bit of a group for Blacktown City with SES, and we've been able to find a few champions that have been really working hard to make sure that community has a voice and that they're connected to us. We're in a very difficult position because we're in this tiny little pocket of the Hawkesbury Nepean. Most of the activity is related to Hawkesbury LGA. We're not in the Hawkesbury LGA. And so that's consequently why we tend to kind of drop off the radar. And so we've set up our own little group with Resilience and SES Council. It's a work in progress over the last 18 months. So I acknowledge there's been some effort to try and improve that and communication. And we do have some people that have been great, but, you know, they're not people who can change the entire system. And I think what we do in disaster management is we actually miss out on the real assets in our community who could be making the work easier for all of us together. And I guess it also comes back to, if you think about that communication principle, who we give authority to be experts in disaster management. And we, the community, apparently are not the experts.
Yeah, Julianne, I've seen that happen too, where a community person has taken on a role as a bit of a conduit to the community in terms of information about an incident, but that person's expertise and standing in the community has been discounted from the ICC. You've probably come across that too?
There was a project after Cyclone Marcia hit us in the recovery where they actually had a look at that community-led leaders and identifying within the community who they were, and then asking them, bringing them together and go, what do you need to be able to continue with this? Because they're very valued. Does everyone notice and value these people? I'm not quite sure yet, but I know definitely there has been some work done, at least in our area, I can talk about here, about, you know, they said they wanted psychological first aid, they wanted these other skills. So that recovery project was able to give them. So they're still in our community now, feeling more capable and confident in what they're doing. That's just one thing that's been done. But yeah, as you said, there's a lot of work still to happen.
We've got a few questions here. So from Lauren Garcia, have any of you had any experience where community, I think it's community engagement, regional people, groups work in with the local government municipal arrangements? For example, where there is a community-based commander who can sit in the local operations centre and be a voice for the community. So you sort of touched on that a bit, Julianne. So Beck, have you seen that in action?
I don't think as seamless as that would you know, suggest. I do know that in the Lismore area, there is, you know, growing pockets of community groups who are essentially, whether the powers that be like it or not, you know, flood rescuers, flood recoverers, they are doing the work. And there is more recognition, particularly in after action spaces, of these people. I would say that is the first step into the conversation. They're coming into the after action reviews, but then they should also, and I'm not aware of this, of a community group or people from the community exercising with the emergency management space. That would be a massive step forward. And then if you go for, I think a lot of things can start in recovery. Oddly, we think about them starting in preparedness, but if you start in the after action review and you go, wow, we need the community to make this better, then you get into exercising with the community and community groups. And then when whatever it is hits, you're prepared, you've got the relationships, you've got some of the systems in place to do this in a better way, one step better. But unfortunately, I haven't seen I think there are individual people and individual relationships. That's where our strength lies. You know, there are these little threads are being tied in a variety of, you know, local areas, but it's not systemic yet.
Angela, you were nodding. What were you thinking?
Yes, I am. And I totally agree with you, Rebecca. In our local context, I do want to shout out to Mim, who's from the SES, who has been a wonderful local champion working with us in the chamber. And if we think about communication as a principle in a disaster, you know, having that relationship with her, as Rebecca describes, has enabled us to actually get some traction to get better outcomes for community. And it's as simple an example as they're calling us and the chamber to say, I'm flooded, I need help, what do I do? And then we're able to, Sue, who was working with us, was the one-on-one contact with Mim saying, okay, we need help over there, we need an assessment here, you know, whatever we need roads closed here, because we were on the ground. So I do agree with you, Rebecca. I think, you know, we found some people, for want of a better expression, we've latched onto and they've accepted us and we're achieving some good things. But as I said to you at the beginning, systemically, the system is not designed to work and listen to community. And that's I think that's where we could really make a difference, have a bigger impact.
I think it's an opportunity for communicators to lead up. I mean, I always think there's opportunity for that, but I think this is a space in which we can give good evidence of the value of these relationships and the expertise of people from and in the local community.
Yeah, there seems to be a terrific platform for that from the fallout from the 2019-20 bushfires, and also the stalling of the recovery at Lismore. So, yeah. Sue Jack has
one thing to that, Barbara, sorry.
Oh, yeah, go.
In terms of that communication, the other challenge we found, and I don't know if this is across the board, you know, you've got people in these agencies, very senior people with very specific roles, and there's wonderful documents around how that should all work. But then their understanding of those definitions and those roles could be very different. And so when we talk about communication in a disaster with community, that makes it challenging if you haven't got people that are really even clear on what the scope of their work is. And then we're trying to ask them to do something. So I don't know about the rest of the panel members, but that has been something that we've experienced.
Yeah, Terry Anderson has made an amazing comment here. She feels that, Angela, you are highlighting the experience of the command and control model, which doesn't have a place for empathy. The nature of the controller, the trust relationships and their focus on the community-centered communication is key. So how can we better influence this? So Julianne, you seem to be a little bit down the track on this.
And make sure I'm off mute. Yeah, so the command and control structure and everything, I've noticed we've got some very special people in our area who are very community minded, and they are very much on the forefront of how do we make sure that the community is aware of what's going on and what we suggest that they need to do to remain safe. In the same token too, that we're trying to get people to understand their risks so they can make informed decisions for themselves as well.
Julianne, you're talking about operational people?
Yes.
And just as an aside, Kelly had a question earlier that you answered mostly, but she was just also asking about the size of your team.
One. So I'm the only, there's 7 engagement officers in Queensland. I'm one. And how about building your team, it's about we're looking at other people who are passionate about community engagement. We also have a team of what we call volunteer community educators. And they assist too with going out in the community and engaging with the community, bringing back some information about the different areas. I mentioned too about our regional community engagement network. We're building that network of people so that we can actually hear what's happening on the ground, and local solutions. So community talking with community and coming up with what do you need to actually be more prepared for these disasters and emergencies. And as a region, how can we help you to do that?
Julianne, the Queensland system's a little bit blurred in terms of response into recovery. So how much do you get involved in the recovery process?
I actually want to become more and more involved with the recovery process, because I think there's gem information. Going through the disaster and listening to the community, and then understanding what improvements, or what more can we do, what information do we need to give you, the community, so that they are actually really understanding what's going on and what didn't work. Like, what did they not understand about warnings or the information that was coming out, things not to do in the future. So we're ensuring that we're giving the right information so that they can leave safely and that type of thing. In recovery work, a lot of those projects come in and they look for the support of the different services in QFES. So it's about that coordinating the right people with the right project, that type of thing. But definitely there's so much value in working in recovery to reduce the effects on people in operations, definitely.
So Angela, do you see that disconnect between response and recovery from your perspective?
I do. So a good example of that was people who finally this time were listening to the alerts, getting information from us. We were trying to share everything that SES was sending through. But then they were actually getting ready to evacuate a little bit earlier and not leave it for the last minute with children. And then when they rang us and said, where do we go? Nothing was set up. The evac centre wasn't ready. There was no emergency housing set up yet. So they're getting messages to get ready to prepare to evacuate. They're trying to do the right thing and not end up in a crisis disaster scenario with the lives at risk. So I think they're the sort of examples where with the communication, and someone mentioned this earlier, everyone kind of has their box that they fit in and their job, and they do that. And they do that well, but we don't seem to connect the dots. So I think that definitely has been experienced in our community. And having a pocket in this precinct with over 14,000 new people have moved in a 5-year period who've never experienced flooding in that neighbourhood, and started getting those urgent text messages at all hours. And that created a lot of panic. And I guess in terms of communication, something to think about is, when people are buying or tenanting in these neighbourhoods, where does that communication fit in that process so that they're aware? They don't have to panic. You can still live there quite safely. But where do you get information for that? I think that's perhaps a gap in our communication cycle. Why wait for the disaster to be on our doorstep? Yeah.
Hey, Barb, I just want to talk to the empathy idea a little bit, because it's one that's sort of pretty important to me, which is that I think we can systematise empathy. There are some people, that we know the leaders in our organisations and worldwide for whom empathy is a natural thing. Jacinda Ardern comes to mind. Whatever the positives and the negatives of the policies, we know that she comes from empathy when she does her work. But there are people who are not, for whom this is not so natural. And I think one of the things that communicators can do and community engagement people can do really, really powerfully is report on context the same way that operational people report on the sit rep, the situation. We can tell our organisation what is going on, what the consequences of this emergency or disaster are for the community. We can say, this is happening, this is happening. If we do it in a quite systematized way, then it starts to look as real as these roads are flooded up to this height. And I think that is a way that we have the capacity to lead up or to make change and to make empathy part of the system rather than just something you get if you're lucky and somebody's, a leader is inclined towards that. Mm. It is, it is work we can do. It's not always easy and you have to keep offering it, but I think it's possible.
I've been saving a question from Sue Jack because this is a big one for us. It comes up quite regularly in EMPA gatherings. So what strategies, what community-focused communication do we use to connect with the hard-to-reach members of the community? And she's particularly interested in the vulnerable or people who've lived experience of disability, and also people with no access to technology.
Barb, I might just comment on the disability sector. There's been a huge amount of work. Michelle Villeneuve, and I apologise if I got that pronunciation wrong, in Queensland and all over Australia, I believe, with the person-centred emergency planning program. So we have been working very solidly with that, and I think it's a fantastic idea. Where there's 3 stages in it. The first stage is identifying people with a disability to become a peer support for other people, and they go through and work with people with disabilities about themselves, about what do I need in a disaster or emergency, what things do need to happen. They plan for that. It's also looking at the agencies who are working with people with disabilities, getting them to understand the process. And then also that next stage is about getting all anyone who writes disaster management plans to really be thinking about people with disabilities, and also exercising the situation. We've had numerous times with floods and everything where some of our people have gone out to check houses and that, and people have been in their homes flooded who can't get out for 3-5 days and everything like that. We've seen some really good work happening where people who are talking with one lady, and she was did not know what to do in the beginning. She's now an advocate, and it's just amazing work. So that is, you can find it on the website. I can send the link through. Have a look at that. It is fantastic.
I've found a link, and I'm hoping Bianca can send it through on the main chat. Angela, I think you were going to say something to Sue's question.
I was. We've actually found that because we work with vulnerable cohorts anyway, that a lot of the people living in that floodplain, we have relationships with them. So we were able to, when we knew this was coming, we were able to do a quick update to them and say, hey, have you heard this info? And many of them aren't listening to mainstream news. And then when the alerts were coming through, we were able to send a text message saying, have you seen this? And those who are technologically connected were relying on our Facebook page. A lot of people struggled with the 132 500 number, the SES, because it was inundated with callers. We have great relationships with some of our local agents and businesses, so we were able to get them through their channels to let people know. We also have what I call a little shanty town down here. People living in that floodplain are very much low SES and vulnerable. We did reach out we did some letterbox drops on foot. We reached the local police and said, hey, can you just do a drive-by and say hello and see if anybody needs anything, and are they aware with what information's coming through? So we did lots of different channels to connect, but we still found there were people out there that are now just coming through that we didn't reach. And I don't know if there is a range of mechanisms that we need to look at, and it'll be different for each community, but it is very resource intensive, and we have to work together with lots of different stakeholders in community, and that's where we get much better outcomes.
Yeah, so real community-led engagement and communication there. Beck, you're nodding.
Oh, I've done a little bit of work with a group that specialises in supporting the needs of the autism spectrum community and those families. And of course, one of the central challenges that community face is communication. So processing information, and particularly processing information quickly, is a massive challenge to them. And also doing things that are unexpected can be really challenging as well. What this organisation in Southwest Sydney were doing is they were proactively, because all the questions, like you, Angela, all the questions were coming to them, not to the normal channels. And they reached out into the emergency services, and they were building relationships with the police force and local emergency management to enable the whole process to work, so that they would have good information, so that they would be able to do preparedness work with that quite particular community. What's really interesting, though, is that there's a principle, and I can't remember the name, but the idea of it is that work that communities do to support those with disabilities also helps all of us. So one of the things that, so that the ramp is actually better than the stairs. One of the things that almost every vulnerable community would ask of emergency communication is that it is as simple as possible, and that it uses visual aids as well as words. And I think we are improving at that. And the thing is that helps vulnerable communities, and it also helps everybody, because in an emergency and disaster, we're all facing challenges of communication. So, even though it is a labour intensive thing and it can be challenging, I'd argue that it's worth doing, because you're likely to reach everybody better.
I agree. And having a look in what's called peacetime, how do people receive messaging anyway? And how do they like to actually communicate? If we can understand that better, that's going to help us, because when disaster's on, it's panic. You don't necessarily think very straight at that time. So you go back, a bit of muscle memory. So I know a particular area, a little community, one way in, one way out, where they get their information is the general store, a tiny little place, and that's it. That's the communication method for that area. So I think understanding your communities, definitely.
And that sort of looks at that that problem of lack of technology as well, because we do have to face it. At some point, our systems are going to fail, and that's all we're going to have left is the notices at the local shop or the service station or the neighbourhood centre, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that was actually highlighted. I believe it was 2011 when XTC Oswald comes through, and we all the phones went down. I don't know if you remember that. So, yeah, definitely having those contingency plans. You can't rely on the phone lines or the electricity working. Probably not a smoke signal in a bushfire. But some other form of communication.
Definitely.
Yeah. And we even suggested those, those portable electronic notice boards, like where you could get them out safely and people are seeing them and they can get messages out. And I think the challenge for us, and you've all touched on this, is when we have a disaster like fires and floods and the whole telecommunication system is out, that becomes really hard. And if people are stuck in their homes flooded in, they can't get out to see anything. I don't have easy answers to that, but I think it's we're very good in community at innovating and being flexible and thinking outside the square. I think we do that very well. So, yeah.
Could I just add one experience that I've had with the portable electronic boards, not personally, but if you're going to do that, lock up your generator with it. We've had people steal the generators from the boards because there was no electricity. So I would find some way of locking it.
Couple of questions. So from Misha Hill, Kia ora, she's from New Zealand, I think. In the area of accessibility and visuals, do you have any tools or examples that you've used for getting out key messages in past events to help with this?
I actually do somewhere. I'm not sure, they could be on the EMPA website, but I wouldn't promise it. But this organisation does have a list of, a flick chart of some of the visuals that they use, ambulance, police. There would be quite a few organisations who have that, but I'll see if I can find it and share it out to the attendees here. I don't know if
What about you, Angela?
We haven't, and the community in our community that are on that floodplain, we haven't had anyone that we've worked with that we know has a disability in that way. So because it is a small community, it's not a huge catchment as in some of our neighbouring LGAs. So for us, we're in a slightly different position in terms of who we have in our community, but we know who's in our community. The challenge for us moving forward, I have to acknowledge, is as those populations grow in those neighbouring suburbs, that could be affected. And that is something we'll have to look at as well. Thank you for sharing.
One of the first things I just think about the visual side of things, in preparedness, when we're engaging with the community, we do have visual information with no wording. It's more about educating. But in events, the use of your Auslan interpreters, translators, when they're doing the messaging, we've found that's to be coming back from the community saying we like that. Something with the news feeds and everything, sometimes they'll cut off half of the person, which is frustrating with people with a hearing impairment, because they're only literally getting half the story. So if they can sort of concentrate and having those people on, that will help them as well.
Yeah, and I think at the EMPA conference, either this year or last year, we had Erica Kulagowski talking about the importance of visuals and how they can actually work. So if I'll see if I can track down her resource too, that would be handy. Ewan's asking if you have considered A4 back-to-back newsletter type pages for those circumstances, such as experienced by Toowong Shire. Tanya Marie is telling us that they lost mobile communication for a long time in 2019, 2020 Black Summer fires. So those newsletters, have you ever found a circumstance to use those?
Absolutely. They're just one of the tools in the toolbox. No one form of communication is the panacea for success. It needs to be really focused on the community. And with Agnes Water Fires 2018, one example, they put out every day, would go around little local shop, into the businesses, into the tourists. Tourists is another big thing for us as well, to build up that regular information about what's happening. So it works really well. Thank you.
Angela and Julianne, you've both been involved in communities that have are on the sort of post 5 years after an event too. So what sort of communication needs are you finding in communities about things that have happened quite a while ago?
Julianne, would you like to go first?
No worries. As I say, I really feel that we're in a bit of a disaster fatigue zone, because we've been hit year after year with something different all the time. We're actually even finding now that people are reassessing their priorities over COVID and everything as well. So communications, we're trying to be just asking people, what do you need? Really having that ground roots, talking with the community, what do you need? And not just providing, oh, you need to know this information. It's like, well, what's your perception of your risk? Do you understand it? Something with that last 5 years that we've found, we've got, like you said before, a huge amount of people moving to Queensland, sight unseen, never seen the area, don't understand the risks or the climate of Queensland. Homelessness too, increase in homelessness. So communications in disasters, how do you reach the people who are living in their cars or the caravan? And we're also seeing an increase in tourism with the caravans, and the camper sales gone through the roof. So that's our a new focus too that we're looking at.
Angela, what's your experience with the long term?
Like everyone else, there's disaster fatigue. But I guess for us, we've really been supporting people to make informed choices about where they're choosing to live. The housing affordability in most places, but certainly where we are, it's not affordable. And there's almost zero rental vacancies, and the rentals are expensive. And where people are living currently on that floodplain, it's not quality accommodation at all, which is why it's dirt cheap. So I guess for us, part of it is, like Julianne, looking at what do they need ongoing. And what's coming out of that is a lot of support around advocacy and enabling people to feel empowered to have a voice, to go to their elected members and say, these things need to change because it's stopping me from moving on. We do have a couple of, we do have some properties down there of homeowners, but those homes were built over 100 years ago. They've been in the family forever. They're earmarked by planning and council to become either green space or a major road to alleviate, exits and traffic and whatnot, but not for development of residential. But no one will purchase the property. So, they can't sell it. They can't move. They're in limbo. So there's some really, initially it's that immediate relief, immediate disaster response. But for some of these people, it's a long-term horrible experience where they really feel the system and the decision makers are almost deliberately keeping them in a risky position, and they've got no choices. So I think that's really hard, trying to support people in those circumstances to navigate all those pathways. And the reality is there's so many things in community that we don't control, and that as a community service org and others around us, there's other individuals and entities that have decision-making rights. And if we think about recovery and disaster management and communication, I guess I'm going to beyond that period of the flood's gone, the water's receded, people have cleaned up, they're starting to move back in or move elsewhere. But for those who can't move, it almost stops. It's like, yep, job done, ta-da, see you later. I think that's a real gap in our system.
There's
one last question from Caroline, and it touches on preparedness, which we haven't talked much about here. What is the trick, the hook or the motivator that you use to get people to connect and prepare before an event?
That's a big question.
It is.
That's a big question.
It's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know whether it's a trick or a hook, but it's just being in the community. So really building trust or just maintaining trust and everything like that, where different communities, we've found different things work. Like it might be just the local grocery store on the Saturday morning in the little community, just having someone there and people just having conversation, that type of thing. Sometimes you will hear information during that operational phase where you're responding. You'll hear little things that are happening, so that after it, you can go back and then try to address it. That's just a few things that I've seen. Community groups as well, and your partners, talking with them. They can tell you how their little section of the community is doing.
Rebecca?
It is a big question, of course. Like if we had the answer to this, everybody would be safe. But there is some stuff. Kim Johnston just said storytelling. I think that's true. I think given that we are pretty much all of Australia is pretty much impacted by long-running disaster right now, and there is that weariness. I think some stuff that points everybody's attention to what our communities do know, what they have learned, what they're already doing, because the fact is that they are phenomenal. They keep each other safe. I've done community meetings where people were emergency management and emergency communicators. So we have, I think that we as a sector can do work in the space of uplifting our incredible our incredible capacity and acknowledging the self-efficacy of the communities in which we work, I think. And then we can add to that. If we go into the space where we're telling the story of how cool they are, we can add some of our knowledge and some of our wisdom and some of our systems and some of our preferences into that. I think storytelling is a really good start. On the weariness subject, do you know the biggest incoming calls to Lifeline in the last 2 years of all these emergency impacts was the 1st of January, simply because people went, we're not still here. So I think it's important to understand that is one nice, devastating metric about the communities that we're serving at the moment. They are weary and we need to communicate with them knowing that.
Part of that challenge also, Rebecca, thank you, is the idea of rushing back to business as usual.
Oh, I hate business.
And we don't have business as usual. We probably won't for a long time. So I think it's about all of our systems and services just accepting that and then creating a new usual that allows people time to grieve, recover, seek help, whatever that looks like. And not just for the people we serve, but for our workforce too, because I find that's what's forgotten a lot as well, is we also have families affected by floods and pandemic, and everyone's burning out. So I just feel like we need to start a conversation about what's the new normal.
Something I have heard from the ground is people coming out to say you need to be more resilient in this. It's really dangerous telling a person who's just been through this horrible disaster, you need to be more resilient. So
it's a terrible message, Julianne. Yeah. The idea of resilience is awesome, but the judgment of not being resilient enough is damaging. I agree.
Yeah. And, it wasn't done in malice or anything, seeing these people, but it just need to be very wary.
Yeah. And we're going to have to wrap up. And as Lauren has said in the chat, it would be amazing if we shared more of the good stories of what people are doing and doing effectively. And one of the reasons that EMPA is here is to become that community of practice where we can share those really good news stories about what people are doing that works. So if anyone in the audience today has a story like that, we would love to feature it in the webinar, at the conferences, and in some sort of forum. And we're getting a new website too. So hopefully we'll become a bit more of a clearinghouse for that type of knowledge, where we can store all of that. Thank you all so much for coming. I just wanted to highlight that Monday, August 15 is our next Disaster Diaries, the EMPA Book Club, and we're looking at a research article on handling false information in emergency management. So watch out for the email about that early next week. And we also have the New Zealand conference coming up on October 17 to 18. So if you're in New Zealand, sign up now. If not, plan a break. You all need one. And make sure it coincides with the conference. So it's a really great lineup as usual. Thank you all to our panelists. An amazing conversation. I wish we could go for another hour. There's so much more to cover. And to everyone who came, please get in touch with us if you have some of the good stories that can help us solve this really gnarly problem. Thank you all for coming, and we'll talk to you again at the next webinar.